Okay, sorry, we've had some technical difficulties there, but we're back on track now. So, Dr. Clark, I was asking you, please tell us a little bit about your dissertation.
So, my doctoral dissertation, my advisor was actually studying how children did gross motor skills, but I was more of a sort of an information processing person, so I was interested in how children sort of programmed, selected and programmed their motor responses. So although she always lovingly said, "That's interesting, Jane," she let me go off to do what I wanted to do, which was to do a study on the development of response selection and response programming, which used reaction time as a dependent measure. And no one else was doing this kind of work, so I had to have the equipment built, and I didn't do a lot of piloting work to start with because, of course, we didn't have a lot of children around. But I did have a dear friend from way back when who taught in a school district just over the border into Illinois, and she got her principal to let me test kindergartners and fourth graders in their school. So they gave me a book room, and I had brought down my equipment, and I spent 3 weeks there collecting my data. And it was basically a reaction time using Donder's method and Sternberg's methods of decomposing reaction time to look at how much time a child took to make a response selection, and then to look at how long it took them to sort of put together the program that they were going to use. It was a little flawed, but the response selection processing actually worked out pretty well. And later I was to use it with senior citizens who had been doing a video game playing. So I'll just sort of jump ahead a little bit, but while no one on my dissertation committee really understood what I was doing, they were all very supportive, and they all, sort of said, yeah, that's a good idea, and I got a nice finding, not really very revealing at that time until I did my work on the seniors, where the seniors were playing video games and practicing and becoming very good at a game called Pac-Man, just to date us, and they actually improved their response selection processing, which is the same as making a decision while you're driving a car and trying to decide whether you should slam on the brakes or take a left quick turn and veer over something that's coming your way. So the ability to quickly make a response is what I was studying. And later when so my sort of take-home message from the seniors was, encourage your grandfather and grandmother to play video games because they'll actually become better at making their response choices when they're driving the car.
No, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Clark, you're just
let me just say one other thing. One of the other things was all the kids in the school knew I was there in the book room, and they wanted to know who was the fastest because I kept encouraging them to be fast. And one of the take-home messages I would give to young people is I went back into the classrooms and explained the, quote, experiment they were in. And all those children who are in kindergarten and fourth grade, they thought an experiment was something you did in chemistry. So they had no idea that you could actually have a behavioral experiment. And then I really walked them through and said, well, who do you think would be faster, the people doing this or doing that? And so it actually was a good idea so that you give back to the classroom teacher if you go into a school and test the children there. So.
Right, that's great.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Clark, your distinction of becoming a Distinguished Scholar of NASPSPA recognizes your long-standing contributions in the areas represented by your research. So now we'd like to move on and talk and share some of your ideas about your scholarly adventures. So first of all, let me ask you, what sort of research interests did you have early on? And you told us a little bit about that. And then did you continue to pursue that line throughout your career? And if you changed your directions, tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah, so fundamentally, my question has always been about how to help people learn motor skills, and to see that as something that is developmentally changing across your lifespan. So how a child learns something and how a 14-year-old learns something are different because of the histories and their experiences in movement. So I haven't actually ever changed that. But I was always interested also in what I will say, the sort of coordination of the multi-segmented body. So I was doing reaction time, so nothing's really moving except your forefingers and your fingers of your hand. And so I was trying to figure out a way to actually look at gross motor skills, but still bring the rigor of the tasks of the laboratory to it. So when I got to the University of Maryland, I had a number of colleagues who were in biomechanics. So I actually went back to my roots, which was what my advisor had been doing, which was gross motor skills, and looked at the development of the coordination of gross motor skills of projecting the body, that is, the standing long jump. And then one day, one of my new first graduate students, doctoral students here, I had a baby who was learning to walk. And he brought him into the lab one day, and we started, discussing how do babies learn to walk, because, of course, this is your first really gross motor behavior that is going to afford you the rest of your life, that and feeding yourself, walking and getting to your food, and then eating your food. Those are the sort of essentials in life. So at that same time, Schmidt and Shapiro had done a paper on the generalized motor programs. So you have to remember that motor programs were what everybody was talking about in the information processing world. And so sort of playing off of that, we started on a cross-sectional study of babies walking. You really, as a developmentalist, you first have to understand what's the landscape, what's kind of going on as babies learn to walk before you really go into a developmental study. And there's been a lot of studies done on walking, back with McGraw and Gazelle, but they really weren't looking at it in the same ways that we were looking at it. And so we did this study. I used to stop my car in the middle of the street and run up to someone who looked like they had a baby who'd been walking like a toddler and say, "How long has your baby been walking?" And they'd look at me like, "What?" I said, "We're doing this study. Would you bring your baby in?" And so we did this whole massive study of children walking from basically their first year, when they first start walking, at 1 year till about 2 years of age. And then eventually that the whole world sort of switched from information processing to dynamical systems. And then we started looking at this walking in a much different way. Sort of, what do you get for free when you learn to walk? Why is it that walking is so easy? So we then continued our work along those lines. We weighted the limb to look at what happened to changing initial conditions. We looked at the transition from walking to the next step, which is running, walking to running, and then from running to actually a gallop, which is the first time you uncouple the 180-degree phasing or 50-50 phasing to an asymmetric gait. And that takes a little while. And then we looked at from there to skipping. And, of course, we were always looking at jumping. So I had this sort of foray into all of these gross motor behaviors. And then a colleague of mine, who was actually a graduate student of Scott Kelso, is also a distinguished scholar of NASPSPA, and one of my colleagues from graduate school, and your colleague, Benny. So ships don't just pass in the night, We're always, kind of connected. And his student, John Jacob, had come to take a position here as an assistant professor. And John, who had been doing a lot of work on the coordination of multiple limbs, decided he was going to look at postural control. And he had a really cool paradigm for looking at what Michael Turvey used to say, how light gets into the muscle, which is basically how to use information to manage the multi-limb system. So John and I started on a set of experiments, and his daughter Zoe was actually our first subject. We have a thank you to ZJ in our paper on that, in which we looked at, I call it the coffee table experiment, in which we looked at how babies used surfaces to control their posture. And at that point, we started looking at postural control as it related to upright walking. And so we pretty much did that for quite a long time. So that led from there to a grant with NSF on basically fundamental science on what's going on in the multisensory system as we learn as babies to stand upright and manage independent standing. And then how does that happen? How does that change as you learn to walk? But NSF isn't very interested in our fundamental processes of motor control and coordination. So in talking with a number of people, someone indicated it would be really good if you looked at a problem that people have in the motor system. And there are a lot of problems with the motor system in children, cerebral palsy being the most obvious one. But those are very complicated and not so easy. So I thought I was taking on a less complicated one when we started to study children with developmental coordination disorder or children with DCD. It just turns out that they're just as complicated because atypical brain development is not, it's not like tractable in the same way. But for the next decade, we really looked at children with developmental coordination disorder, basically funded by the NIH. And that was probably one of the most rewarding times. So remember, if we go back to the first question I asked when I first started going off to do graduate school, was to figure out how people learn motor skills. That was typically developing children. Now, how does that change when we look at children who are atypically developing and how it is that they learn to learn a motor skill? And they reveal just as much about typical learning as we learned about atypical learning in atypically developing children. And so that was, I really enjoyed that. And so I'm sort of going all the way down to the path of where we are today. So in the midst of this study on children with developmental coordination disorder, you may remember that the Wii came out, the game that you could hook up to your TV and you could do. And in that was something called Dance Dance Revolution. And one of the children's father showed me that one of our children in our study who had DCD could do this. And I thought, wow, this would be physical activity you could do at home. This would be very good for the child, et cetera, et cetera. So we started looking at this, and it actually fit with a colleague of mine who was doing some work with stroke and aging. And we started looking at what the literature in cognition, or the psychologists would call, is motor sequence learning. So if you're talking about Dance Dance Revolution, is you take a step to the right, you take a step to the left with your left foot, then you step to the right foot and you step back, kind of until it's like whack-a-mole with different spots on the floor you're supposed to go to, except that an avatar is telling you how to do this. So we took the avatar out and then made it into a whack-a-mole game. And that has led us for the next decade, really, to study the learning of motor sequence learning. So from this child in my study with children with DCD my research comes full circle back to studying how we learn motor skills, both implicitly and explicitly. And that's what we've been doing for the last almost a decade again. And we've done that with children, adults, and actually with Parkinson's patients. So there's a take-home message here, which is you start with core questions that actually you never lose. And mine were, how is it that we learn the control and coordination of our multi-segmented body? And that's never changed. But what I've done is I've changed tasks, and probably one of the few people who's looked at arms, legs, and posture. Some people only stick on one thing, like only looking at arm control, or they're only locomotion people, or, But I can say I've looked at all the effector systems.
Okay. I think the next question, I think you've already answered. The next question was, what's the basic question or underlying issues behind your research and what you've tried to learn? So I think you've explained that, unless you want to add anything else.
Nope, I'm good. I think I just said that.
You're good there. Yeah, I think you covered that pretty well. So think back, Jane, over your career, and tell us about a research project that you were particularly interested in, proud of, or made you feel maybe had an impact on the field. And then also, were there other researchers who had a profound influence on you?
So I've looked at that question a lot and thought about what studies that I think, have made a difference. And, one of the ways you look at that is by your citations or something like that. And I'll tell a story that dates us. And this goes back to my video game playing in elderly. That was actually the term that was used then, not older adults, but elderly. because in the, I guess it was the 80s when we were doing that work. That's what we used, the term elderly rather than older adults. And that was a study that I did. It was published in the Journal of Gerontology, one of the best journals. And I was pretty proud that I did that. But I was really focused on the other end of the lifespan. So I never really followed up on my work on video game playing in seniors, right? So now speed forward 20 years. And if you go to my Google Scholar profile and you click on that paper, which I think is my third cited paper, you'll find that it was not cited at all for about 15 years, because I never even cited it, because I didn't follow up on the work. But once we had Google Scholar and people put in the words video game and senior, they found this paper. And they was like, wow, look, and they got faster. And it was a spatially incompatible task. This is cool. And sometimes they just say, sometimes you could cite it just because it was about video game playing. But so I think it's the power of doing science today that I find, most interesting, because this paper would just stay in the Journal of Gerontology forever, and if no one cited it or never seen it. And how you find other articles is you look at what's referenced in the next article you read. So you're in graduate school and you get a new article, and the first thing you do is look at their citations to see if there's an article you might have missed. In today's world, it's just all Googleable. So you're just looking at Google Scholar to find things, and then you look at what it's been cited, and then you can find others. So there's a pathway, but it's a very different pathway. So that's, I would say that's one of my kind of interesting stories as to what is most relevant. I would say probably all the work I did with infants and their postural control is probably ultimately most useful to those who are in physical therapy, though I don't know that it really always gets translated that way. My most cited papers are actually papers where I describe how to think about motor development in general, because most people think it's kids, it's motor development. That's not right. A developmentalist is someone who's really looking at the history of someone, and how from what you do when you're a 5-year-old and what you do when you're 10-year-old and how they're related to each other. But there also says that a 5-year-old learning is different than a 10-year-old learning. There may be fundamental principles of neuroplasticity, but they're going to be different. They're going to play out differently in a 5-year-old than a 10-year-old. Anyhow, but when I was teaching, I created a metaphor based on some paper I once read by Jerome Bruner, a famous developmental psychologist, in which he said development was a lot like a mountain. And so I created what is called the mountain of motor development. And I meet people in Europe who have read this paper. Oh, the mountain of motor development. I'm going, really? No, we're not talking about 10,000 citations, but I think that it really did what I had wanted to do, which was to provide a heuristic for how to think about what it takes to get up to the mountain of motor development, how to become skillful and proficient. And we eventually, I did a sort of boring first paper, but one of my doctoral students and I wrote a second one in which he kind of helped me make it a little bit more lively, I guess, or easier to read. That was Jason Metcalf. And so that's actually my most cited paper. As to who has had the most influence would be probably Esther Thielen, who's now, who passed away a number of years ago. But Esther was a person I met I think Scott Kelso actually introduced me to her. At NASPSPA was here in Maryland in 1982, and Scott stayed at my house, and we went for a run. Those were the days when we ran, and he told me about this woman he'd met at University of Missouri Columbia, named Esther Thielen, and I sent her a note and said, "Could you send me your papers?" People didn't have email, so you would actually send a postcard to people saying, "Could you send me your reprint?" And then eventually she became a dear friend, and her approach to development, because she was originally an anthropologist, and anthropologists and developmental scientists have a lot in common. We have a lot of naturalistic tendencies, and I think that that is look at what the system is doing in the context of what its behavior is doing, and so I'd say that she had the most influence. And she actually helped me to understand why I love teaching preschool swimming, because you can't teach, quote unquote, teach a person to swim when they're 3 years old, but you can certainly help them learn to swim. You see, teaching is something you do to someone, whereas learning is something that you help facilitate in a child. And it's the approach to, setting tasks and getting them to changing the constraints of the task, and all of a sudden they find the answer themselves. And that was that I understood it intuitively, but it wasn't until I had the tools of dynamical systems that I could really explain that in a way that made sense to me.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So you've had a long history with NASPA. You've mentioned it a couple of times. So just tell us a little bit about your involvement with NASPA over the years and some of the roles you've taken on there.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at my Vita for all the roles I've had. But when I remember I didn't go to NASPA when we were in graduate school. This would be in the 70s. But when I went to the University of Iowa with my first job, Scott Kelso was also there. And he told me about this meeting at NASPA, and he said, you should go to it. And I said, I don't know, North American Society for Sports Psychology. That's all I heard was sports psychology. He said, no. It has all these things going on in it, including motor development. So I went to my first one, and I went from then on, because it was certainly the place where you could learn things from people, you could interact with people with the work you were doing. Is a place for your students to find other who will eventually be their colleagues, other colleagues, to sit at a table. We had a meeting once in Mississippi, I think it was. We were at a university, Gulfport, and everybody had to eat together. There was no place else to go in Gulfport. So the best thing about that was that students would sit down at a table with some person whose paper they'd read. And, they'd find out that this person was just a human being like they were, and they would have these great chats. We've gotten a little bigger, and sometimes we go to sites that are not so conducive to people sitting down and chatting with each other. But whenever we do, it's great. So I've been to almost I can tell you the NASPAs I've not been to. And the first one I missed was Trois Rivières, and that was when I was at the University of Pittsburgh. That was fairly early on. But after that, I went to... I've been the program director for motor development. I've actually been the program director, or chair of the program committee for motor learning, which is actually, I just love that, because it shows the two hats that I wear, which is developmental motor learning, some people might say, or developmental motor control. So development is what is stamped on my head, and it's just how I look at that. Mo Weiss, who obviously sees herself as a developmental sports psychologist. And so, development is what pulls us together, and learning, you have to understand learning. So, so I've done that. I've been the publication director. I think that's right. I've never been the secretary-treasurer, I believe. And I have been the president of NASPA. I got the service award one year, which I thought was quite nice, very nice to be recognized that way. Bev Ulrich actually was the president. And we were in Florida, I think. And then, of course, the greatest honor was being a distinguished scholar from NASPA. And I remember when we put this in place, I just give a little sidebar here. It was hard. I think I was looking at the list that you gave me of how long it took us before we really started giving the award to people. So the first two distinguished scholars were, of course, Franklin Henry and Jack Adams. And then that was 81. The next, Franklin Henry and Lawrence Rarick. And then it took us 8 more years to give it to Jack Adams, and finally 3 more years before we gave it to Richard Schmidt. And then we started to give it to each other. But it was because we were all still puppies in a way, and we weren't really ready to say, "Oh, you're distinguished," But because we were all kind of growing up together, and there was this real sense that maybe we weren't good enough to be a distinguished scholar yet. Obviously Franklin and Larry Rarick were distinguished. They were the grandfathers of the field. But it took us a long time to kind of say, okay, we can do this. And now we have them, quite regularly. And that's because we have, a lot of people who have really distinguished themselves in the field.
Right. So do you remember when you got the call that you were being named Distinguished Scholar?
I can't say that I do. Did you call me? I don't remember who called me.
Oh no, I can't remember who it would have been.
I don't know, and I might have known before someone called me, if you know what I mean. Where
okay.
I don't know that. Yeah, I do remember when I was surprised with the service award, but with the Distinguished Scholar, I don't. And I remember when I got in the academy, I remember that, but I don't remember the Distinguished Scholar one. I should. That's really bad. But it's an honor.
But you have mentioned it.
Yeah. I'll say this for the tape. And it's a handful of letters, NASPSPA. So when I was a child growing up, it was NESTLES. Nestle's is the very best chocolate. And so I used to say, NASPSPA, NASPA is the very best society. So, but it's been our home. This is where I see you all the time, Penny. You come together and you see each other and you find out you catch up with your colleagues and find out what's going on and what are the kind of trends that are going on. And one of the best parts of NASPA is we bring people from outside the field in to give us talks, and they kind of spur us on to thinking about things we might not have been thinking about before.
Right. So, Dr. Clark, do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share about where the field's going, or anything you'd like to share with young scholars coming up?
I'm just going to say
other ideas you got to share.
So I would just say this is a joke. We need a new name. No, that's a joke. So the history somewhere, someone should at least chronicle the number of times we all fussed about the name of the association. But clearly, physical activity now is something we were ahead of our time because everything now is about physical activity, and psychology is still about behavior. So it's just sport part that when I have to say that in my provost or someone goes sport. And I'd like to say yes. And what is yours? So if we don't, sport, dance, and all kinds of movement forms are important to our field, and we shouldn't walk away from it. It's just that sport has become entertainment, so it's not ours in the same way. So, but no, my last words to everybody is join NASPA, stay in NASPA. It's a great organization. And may it have another 50 years.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share, because we'll have these words, and as you know, we'll get them posted up on the web so young people coming into the field can hear from our distinguished scholars. So I thank you so much for taking the time to chat, and I hope to see you at the 50th anniversary.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.